So to do anything interesting in the kit bashing, we're going to have to learn some techniques, and these specifically relate to the stack and adding modifiers. So what I've got here is I've got a basic box, and if I click onto the modify panel, you can see here's the name of my box. You can see the modifier list, which is a drop-down list of things I can add. You can see that I have my box and nothing else in the stack, and then you can see I have these parameters for the stack. So I can adjust the height of my box, and I can also adjust the number of segments in the box. But I can't actually see these segments, they're not appearing, and I need to hit F4 on the keyboard, or I need to go up here and toggle on the wireframe. I prefer to work in a shaded view, so I have realistic edged faces. So this is this tick box here, so realistic edged faces. So I can now see what happens when I adjust the height segments in my stack, rather the height segments on my box. So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to add a modifier. I'm going to add a nice simple modifier called the bend modifier. So I'm going to go to modifiers, parametric modifiers, bend. And we're mostly going to deal with parametric modifiers, which are modifiers that work by adding more parameters to the object. And in this case, I'm just going to bend this object. And you can see what happens, that the object becomes bent, which is kind of what we expect. Now if I go back to the box and I reduce the number of segments, you can see that bending something with height segments of 1 is not particularly useful, because if I change the way it bends, you can quite clearly see it's not particularly useful. It's not very bendy, and it's not very bendy because it doesn't have enough segments in it. The more segments I add, the better the representation of the curve of the bend I get, but obviously the more expensive my model becomes. We're not going to be worrying too much about the expense of the model. Okay, so I'm able to change the shape of the object with the bend modifier. Let's put another modifier in. This time I'm using the taper modifier, and I can taper this down. Now, as you can see, what's happening is doing the bend first and then the taper. So if I go and click on the bend, and I can change the bend, we can see here an outline of what the bend is doing, and then we can see what the taper is doing. And I can just turn off the taper. That's the bend. And this is the bend and the taper. Now what I'd really like to do is to taper the box before I bend it, in which case I need to change the order of the stack, and I can do this just by clicking and dragging. And so now I have the taper first and then the bend, and you can see now I can change my taper, and then we can change the bend. So the order of the stack is important. The other really useful button in the stack is this show end result. So what this does is, as it suggests, it shows the end result. If I have the box selected, it will toggle between the box and all of the modifiers being applied. If I have it on show current result, this shows me the box, this shows me the taper, this shows me the bend with the taper. The little light bulb allows me to turn off temporarily one of the modifiers, so I can turn the taper on and off. And there's a little plus box next to these modifiers, and that opens up the center and gizmo controllers, so that we can actually move the center of the bend around. It changes the way the bend works. Similarly, we can do this with the taper. So if I turn my taper on and I shift it up, you can see that this changes where the point of the taper is. I can also add a curve to the taper. Put my end result on. So these parametric modifiers add a great deal of flexibility to a basic primitive, and it means that we can create all sorts of shapes, and most importantly it means that we can make adjustments to those shapes. Because the parametric modifiers respect the original shape and form, I can go in and I can change the length, width, and most importantly I can change the height. And these modifiers will respect those adjustments. So now I can create much more interesting geometry. And let's just up the number of segments on this. And there we go. So I'm going to add one more modifier to this, which is going to be a skew modifier. And you'll notice that I've added it right at the beginning of the stack. So what the skew modifier allows me to do is to basically offset this box. So it's a bit like a rotation without an actual rotation. At the moment it's skewing in the wrong directions. I want it to really skew along this axis. And at the moment, although it's skewing along the y-axis, I don't really want it to do that. So a bit of trial and error with this. That's the x-axis, that's the z-axis. And that's better. It's not better. So let's try the direction as well. There we go. That is probably what I want. That's much better. Now I have a little spiral. That's what I was trying to make. So I can go back in. I can adjust my skew amount, and I can go back down, and I can change my height segments. So up the height, up the number of segments to match. It's doing something odd. It's going a bit crazy. There we go. Eventually, at 200, I get a spiral shape. Just going to up this a little bit more. So the key factor to take away from this is that with modifiers and primitive objects, you can create very, very complicated shapes, ones that would take a lot of work to create if you were just using editable poly.